Questions, comments, reflections from the audience on anything that you heard? I think we heard some interesting and novel ideas. It's up to you to determine, I suppose, the degree of boldness of any of them, but over to you. Sir.
I'm Martin Katz. I'm a historian. I'd like to address this question to the Honorable Senator Cowan. Do you really believe that a council should be formed or a commission could be formed to oversee the Senate in the same way that commissions are being talked about for CSIS, SACIS, in the RCMP?
I don't. I think that, under our system, Parliament is supreme. The House of Commons is a separate institution. It's the master of its own, and the Senate is the same way. And I think if you were to institute some non-parliamentary oversight over a House of Parliament, that would be a great departure from our Westminster system. And I'd not heard that comment, that suggestion until today, so I'd like to think more about it, but I must say that on the face of it, I don't see how it would work.
Do our panelists have comments in relation to anything you heard from each other?
Maybe if I could just respond to the question, since I offered the suggestion. What I had in mind is not creating yet an additional new body for external oversight, but there is already a Senate ethics officer. There is already the Auditor General who has been called in by the Senate to conduct a review. I'm talking about seriously empowering those existing officers to expand their oversight over the Senate.
Simon.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to have a bit more discussion about Adam Dodek's suggestion that we should prohibit senators from having outside employment, prohibit them from electioneering, and prohibit them from fundraising. I don't mind about their outside jobs, although I think we may have to increase salaries if we prohibit them from having outside jobs. And I don't mind so much about telling them not to fundraise. There are lots of fundraisers out there. But what about the idea of muzzling senators out there on the public field, telling them not to electioneer, not to suggest to their people back home, apparently their constituents under the Constitution, who they should be voting for in the next election? I was troubled by that one. I'd like to hear a bit more about it.
Adam.
I agree that it's a troubling suggestion, and certainly probably the most problematic of the three that you mentioned. But in some ways, I think some of the things that Senator Cowan mentioned strengthen my argument. Which one of the things that I found surprising, not necessarily that Senator Cowan said it, but that it exists, is despite all of these mechanisms that exist for senatorial independence, despite the life tenure, the pension, the decent salary, the lack of trying to audition for cabinet or other things that House of Commons members would have, there is still this incredibly strict self-imposed party discipline, as it were. I'm not sure exactly Senator Cowan expressed it in a far better way than I'm expressing it. So despite all of these things, there is still a lack of independence by Senate members. I think that Senate members have to take further steps on their own to disengage from the partisan process, both in order to increase the possibility of independence and efficacy in the Senate, and to even more importantly, to demonstrate their independence to Canadians. Fundamentally, that's what's driving the reforms that I'm offering, is my belief that the Senate as an institution and individual senators have lost the confidence of Canadians. And what do they need to do to try and earn that confidence or earn that trust back?
Senator Cowan.
I've sort of talked about this issue a number of times, and it wasn't until I read David's, I think he used the phrase of the difference between partisanship and party discipline. And to me, that captures it. I mean, I'm a partisan Liberal, and I will be actively involved to helping Liberal candidates who want my help in my province of Nova Scotia. I will have no role in the national campaign. I will not be doing any fundraising for the Liberal Party of Canada. Been there, done that. Not upset about not having to do it anymore. But I think that if somebody said to me, whether it's the leader of my party or anybody else saying, well, you cannot engage in the political discourse in this country, express your views, try to persuade others to agree with you, that's a fundamental breach of my rights as a Canadian citizen. I have every right to express my views on the politics of the day to anybody who's prepared to listen. But I think I can. That's the partisanship, and I'm a partisan, and I make no apologies for it. But I think what I've been trying to say is that with respect to our duties in the Senate, we're not subject to party discipline. And I think that if we, as senators, made that distinction, that it would enable us to kind of square that circle.
Sir.
Yeah, so I'd like Professor Dodek to expand some on his idea of verifying residency. And the reason I want you to is, for me, the issue of residency, I think you're entirely accurate in terms of the Deloitte experience and that senators can determine residency and they can have residency. The question that I have, though, is what is the purpose of this residency? When the Constitution Act 1867 was written, the idea of residency was to ensure diversity as much as regional representation. So, for example, the reason in Quebec there's 25 ridings that were the pre-Confederation ridings was because Alexander Galt wanted to make sure at least one Anglophone Protestant was in the Senate. It wasn't really that Hochelaga needs representation, right? And in my opinion, for the Quebec Court of Appeal, I made that case on how it's evolved. So now there's a Jewish senator from Quebec that's always appointed and so on. So we now have more constitutional conventions on the nature of representation, but it has nothing to do with where you live and whether or not your cottage in PEI is your full-time home. So I'd like you to sort of explain why you think residency is important.
Well, I think as long as we continue to have the Constitution that we have that sets out that divides the country in terms of regions and allocates senators by region, then we have to take those requirements seriously. Now, there may have been additional elements in terms of diversity that you've identified in the creation of that in 1867 or the debates 1864, 65, etc. But certainly the idea that the senators would come from particular regions and from particular provinces was also important. I think the diversity element was built on top of that. So I think that the Senate has completely shirked its duty to ensure that just because the Prime Minister claims that a senator or a proposed senator is from a particular place, that they actually are. We have different notions of representation. We've certainly talked about the importance of the Senate to the provinces and to different provinces, and I think we need to take those constitutional requirements seriously, or we need to move to change them.
Jim.
Well, I don't think many of us have much doubt where we live. Doesn't seem to be if you can't figure out, can't answer the question where you live, you really wonder whether you'd be qualified to do the work in any
question,
in any legend. But just to be clear, every senator is required to provide on an annual basis a copy of the first page of their tax return, so you know where they're paying their income tax. Provide a copy of your driver's license, copy of your health card. So there's no question about that. I can't speak about cases that might be before the courts right now. I don't know what vetting processes we're taken through, but we're gone through. But to me, the point is that senators, one part of the responsibility of a senator is to represent his or her region, province, society, and residency gives you a connection. How can I say that I or purport to represent Nova Scotia if I don't live in Nova Scotia? It just doesn't seem to be, it's just not credible. But there are systems in place that would at least prevent in the future the controversies that have taken place in the past.
Yes, Tommy, Senator Banks.
Question of confirmation. I thought that Professor Dodek's remarks contained a lot of really interesting things about what the Senate could do. But, and I'm asking Jim this question, two of the things that Professor Dodek suggested were that the Senate publish its attendance record and that senators publish their budgets. And I don't know if things have changed since I've been there, but my impression was that for many decades, the Senate publishes its attendance daily, unlike any other legislature in Canada except one territorial one. And secondly, that senators publish their budgets quite regularly on the internet. Has that changed?
No, you're correct, Tommy, and it started, in both, you're right, I think that, I don't believe in the House of Commons that attendance records are published, but they are available in the Senate, and senators do disclose their expenses on a quarterly basis.
Sir.
Hi, Art Grant from Vancouver. Many of the reforms that all three of you discussed deal with reforms that would be done in-house, if you will, using the current model and current systems. And the question I have really is to ask you whether you think those would be sufficient to address the, to use your Professor Dodek's issue here, the democratic legitimacy, integrity deficits that the Senate currently suffers from. If it was done, would that be sufficient to overcome the public's perception of the Senate without doing something more? And to me, I think there needs to be there's some other things that need to be done as well, because coming from the province, when we saw the slide showing the province with the least, or the least representation on a per capita basis, is my province. And you know, we have our 6 senators to, for instance, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick each. They have 10. So that's something that's got to be, I think, still addressed at some point. So do we not need to have at least something additionally done in order to address those sort of concerns?
Andrew, do you have thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. There are steps that need to be done beyond what we've described. Those are more difficult because most of them would require joint federal-provincial action for some kind of formal amendment. So you couldn't change the number of senators a province has without a formal amendment. And opening that up would open up a range of other things. So it becomes more difficult, not impossible, just more difficult, and certainly further down the road. I think all of us were concerned with the issue of what can be done outside of that context. What can we do with the Senate as it is now? And we were trying to suggest a range of options that haven't necessarily been on the table or the public aware of for the current Senate to be changed using initiatives from within. So it doesn't need that joint federal-provincial engagement. It's something that could come within if the will was there. The problem is whether the will is there to do that.
I think someone else, Dawn.
Hi, I just had a simple question about independence. What does independence for the Senate mean? What does that mean in terms of what kind of reforms we should have? There's a bit of a tension going on. Professor Dodek talks about a greater independence, keeping them from fundraising and electioneering, which starts to make it look like we want senators to be independent, a bit maybe more like judges. They're not, even if they had been partisans, they're not going to be upon appointment, and then we start to view them perhaps differently. But you know, others in the room indicate there's some concern with having that for a senator, There might even be charter concerns, if it actually was a law saying you cannot electioneer in this position, especially when historically that's what senators almost always did, and that's probably what helped bring them into that position. So I'm wondering if you have a comment on that. Would it be just an internal rule, a practice? People would try and move in that direction of not electioneering. And just related to that, I wonder for each of you, what does Senate independence mean, especially when there's and why do other senators not behave so independently from the government? In front of the Supreme Court, there was all kinds of information about Senate independence, the duration of their appointment, and if they could be renewed, well, then they'd be induced to toady to the government and that kind of thing. And even if they couldn't be reappointed as a senator, governments have other inducements. So I wonder if you have any comments on the power of a government to induce. Thanks.
I think that's a question all three of you might like to take a shot at. I'm not sure which one of you wants to go first.
Well, I think there's a certain loyalty from somebody who receives an appointment to the person who makes the appointment. I had for those of us who were appointed by Paul Martin, we had certainly I did, I speak only for myself, I had a connection with him, an affinity for him, which doesn't necessarily transfer to successive leaders. And I think that there's a difference, and I can see with senators who are appointed by Prime Minister Harper feel a loyalty to him and a desire to follow his wishes, which I understand. I think is unnecessary, and I think is carried to an extreme, as I say. But I think it comes back to saying, well, all right, you've appointed me. I support your party. I will support your budgets. I will support your speech from the throne. But I don't need to support every private member's bill that you've indicated somehow or other that you'd like to see passed. And that's the situation we've got to now, where there is a government position on everything, on witness lists, on amendments, on private members' bills, on motions, on everything there is a position. And my sense, and maybe Ann would give us a perspective on this, my sense is that has become more controlled and more pervasive than it was in past. Now, what would happen if an election comes and there is a non-conservative government or of some type, or Mr. Harper decides to leave and somebody else comes in? My sense would be that the sense of loyalty of those individuals to the new leader of the Conservative Party would be less. But I think it's where it is it comes back to the point about distinguishing between a partisan conservative. Nothing wrong with that. But when you exercise your role as a senator, then you have to be independent. And that's the difference which I think is lost, the distinction which is lost, and I think it's the source of much of our difficulty right now.
Andrew. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
I'm not sure. I agree with everything that Senator Cowan said. But in light of the current state of the Senate, I guess I'm not sure it goes far enough. And to get back to your question about independence, I think that the Senate needs to be independent of the House of Commons, and it needs to be independent of the government. And that gets back to points made earlier, that because the House of Commons is run on a party system, and because party discipline is critical to the continuation of a government, to passing a legislative agenda in the House of Commons, it is the party discipline that, as Senator Cowan has so aptly put it, is what senators need to be independent of. Where I differ with him, I think, is I'm not sure if we could have a system where senators were free of the party discipline, but still attached to their parties, maybe that would be okay. To me, what we're seeing now, as Senator Cowan has described it, with the changes in the Liberal Party and the Liberal senators, is an experiment. It is a very low-cost experiment because they are not in government. The test of any such reforms is not when you don't have power, it is when you actually do have power. So that will be the true test, as whether, as Senator Cowan has said, whether there is a change of government, whether there is a change of direction by the current government, a change of leadership, whatever, then that will be the test as to whether the sorts of changes that Justin Trudeau has made, that the Liberal senators in the Senate are making, whether they go far enough or whether they are arrested or revert back to old ways. In terms of, I don't particularly have constitutional concerns on the Senate restraining itself. And that's because, as has been identified, Senate rules, the power of each House to make their own rules, to govern their own conduct, is part of parliamentary privilege, which is constitutionally protected, equal to the freedom of expression under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in the same way that there are rules of ethics that for judges that prohibit the sort of expression that and participation that they can make that is different from ordinary citizens, I think that the Senate would be constitutionally entitled to make similar sorts of rules restricting conduct or expression by their own members. It would be more difficult if it was a piece of legislation that the House of Commons made and then the Senate passed. That would be a different problem.
Andrew.
For me, independence in the Senate will occur when no party leadership can control anything it wants in the Senate. So the fundamental thing there is our situation allows it to swing from one party to another. And I think the appointment process should be set up to ensure that no single party can ever have a majority in the Senate. That's the compromise that was reached in the House of Lords, and I think it's a very useful one. When no party can control it, then the stakes are not as high, either for opposition or government. The other side of the coin is, I think part of the problems we have currently are in terms of commitments that are extracted from senators at the time of their appointment. I think it is an abuse of power, quite frankly, for senators to be vulnerable to requirements that they agreed to do this, that, and the other at the time of their appointment. That fundamentally undermines any potential independence once they're appointed.
Why don't we just take two more questions? Sir, you at that mic, and I think Professor Smith, you had a question or a comment, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay, just an observation. I'm sort of sitting on the outside looking in, but Andrew, first of all, I don't think you're a radical. And I think actually of everyone who's talked so far today, you've had the most practical suggestions because they're doable. And as far as the partisanship is concerned, I think maybe it's time for the senators to become partisan Canadians first. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Professor Smith.
Mine was just a comment. I was thinking of this listening to you, and there's one significant difference between the House of Commons and the Senate, in my mind, is the following. The reputation of the Senate is determined by the reputation of the least reputable senator. That's not true of the House of Commons. Even though Canadians will often say they're tired of electoral politics, etc., they have multiple feelings toward individual members and toward the chamber. And usually, even if they don't vote for a member of parliament, their constituent will usually nonetheless hold them in quite high regard. The Senate's not like that, particularly, I guess, because it's not elected. So there is no personal relationship between the citizen and the senator. So the senator and the Senate is a collective public reputation. And I think that any talk or any proposals for changes in that should be at least seen in part against that backdrop. Analogies often don't work between the two chambers.
Good point. Any comments to either of these last two comments or questions? No? All right, well, I think then on behalf of everyone, I want to thank the panel. I leave it up to the audience to determine the relative degrees of boldness that you think you heard here this afternoon in terms of reframing this debate. I think any reframing, my own personal view, if we're going to reframe this debate to get out of the straitjackets in which we presently find ourselves, it will be by way of experiment in relation to everything we've heard from these three gentlemen. In one way or another, it will be experimental. And I think we, as citizens, have to be prepared for some of the messiness and, dare I say, even chaos at times that goes with experimentation. And perhaps even more importantly, party leaders, and in particular the leader, the Prime Minister, and the leader of the party in power, has to be open to a certain amount of messiness if we're going to have any hope within the constitutional constraints under which we presently operate to be able to experiment. I don't think there's anything you heard here today that will not require some courage, some leadership, some experimentation, and it is going to be a little messy. And we're not good, especially I was in a government for 12 years. Arisia knows governments don't like a lot of messiness and a lot of chaos because we've got an agenda, we've got a time frame for that agenda, and we want to drive to the completion of that agenda before the next election. But I think if we're going to, in my personal opinion, humble opinion, have any progress in relation to the Senate right now, we are going to have to be willing to accept a degree of messiness as whatever experiments we choose, we develop, move forward with, and implement. And I wish I were hopeful in relation to our system and our leaders being able to live with and absorb and adapt to that messiness. I don't think I am, but I guess I'm not going to give up hope, gentlemen. And I think you have instilled me with some hope this afternoon that there are things we can do and should do. And therefore, I look forward to continuing and watching this discussion in the months and years ahead. Thank you all.